So first things first, some advice on data gathering. So one of the key kind of parts of the legislation is that the regulators have been very key to emphasise that a proportionate approach is needed when carrying out these assessments. It's not particularly explicit as to what proportionate means, but from kind of in terms of the work that we've been doing and the interpretations that we've made, effectively it's a primarily desktop and visual survey, at least initially. So it will be going through record drawings, doing site inspections to review the general form and layout of the building. Does it look sensible? Are the column grids kind of appropriate? Are the stability elements in the right place? Do the member sizes look about right? There'll be an element of site inspection to look for any kind of signs of distress or movement or anything that might prompt concern. Particularly if there are elements that appear to be undersized and maybe we don't have calculations to kind of show that a transfer beam has been designed to work at a certain depth, then just a kind of an untrained eye who's looking at the drawing, beam looks smaller than it should be, or the transfer slab looks smaller than it should be, then you would go into a kind of more detailed review and assessment. The theory is that you're not necessarily looking for problems, you're just trying to kind of make sure that the building makes sense and is logical. And obviously the more information that's available, the easier it is to do that. And if there are gaps, you might need to fill them in due course. The assessment itself, the approach can vary depending on the nature of the building. So it could be based on past performance, particularly if they're quite old buildings that maybe predate sort of more modern design codes. They wouldn't necessarily lend themselves to a kind of more traditional calculation approach. So it might be a degree of looking at past performance in similar buildings and generally the condition of them. It could feasibly be based on calculations or kind of spot checks and review, scheme design guidance, etc. And also to some degree on investigations and further review. But I'll talk about all of that in subsequent slides. So starting from a kind of desk study basis, there's various sources of information that are kind of where you're going to get your information from. So the number one source is going to be the record information. And as per the previous session on the golden thread, hopefully, the principal accountable person will have a full set of information that relates to both the original design of the building and then its ongoing use and operation. So that would hopefully include structural drawings, maybe reinforcement or fabrication drawings, depending on the materials that are used, drawings for other disciplines, such as architectural plans, building services plans with kind of services provision, particularly things like gas, and any services that may be run underneath the building. It might include specifications, testing data from construction, such as concrete cube strengths. Ideally, although we haven't had any of these really, calculations, or more likely you might find design philosophy statements where at least you have some clarity as to what the basis of the original design was. Things like ground investigation reports that might highlight any kind of particular concerns around aggressive ground or settlement, etc. And then fire strategy and compartmentation drawings, which will obviously be relevant from a structural fire resistance perspective. On top of that, there's a number of kind of broader documents that are very helpful in informing that risk assessment procedure. So there's various I-Strat documents, which I'll talk about some other examples, plus obviously the code that the forthcoming document that I've mentioned. Historic design codes are very helpful, particularly if you obviously know when the building was built, you can have a decent stab at what the overriding design requirements would have been at the time, and can therefore kind of review against that in terms of, say, element sizes or fire resistance of members. Scheme design documents are also very helpful in terms of looking at kind of initial sizing of elements to see if things look about the right size. Similarly, detailed design guidance can be useful in terms of informing what you're looking at. Manufacturer's literature, so things like load span tables for metal deck, for example, will help to give you a feel as to whether spans are appropriate as well. The Blue Book for steelwork is another example, and then the cross newsletters and reports are also helpful. Something that I think has been mentioned on these sessions before and is in the published more widely, the I-Strat compiled a compendium of common types of higher risk buildings. So this document is available on the I-Strat website, and it gives some general steer on typical forms of building based on kind of age and visual condition, and helps to identify some of the kind of common issues that you might want to look for, as well as giving you a fighting chance of maybe understanding how certain buildings work, which particularly if there's a shortage of record information, can be difficult when you allow for partitions and finishes and everything else that are going out of their way to hide the form of structure. It's definitely a starting point. I don't think you could rely solely on the kind of steer from this document, but it might help to give you at least a starting point as to what you might need to look for. Other useful sources of information. So Technical Report 70 is very helpful, which kind of talks about the evolution of concrete design through the years, and again, can help then steer you to the appropriate design codes that would have been in place at the time of construction and inform your review. Other documents, so the recently issued guidance on transfer slabs, that includes sort of scheme design rules around kind of rules of thumb for how thick a transfer slab would need to be for different numbers of stories, which can be quite useful when you're doing your initial desktop study to see if the sizes seem about right. There's obviously guidance around finite element analysis, concrete and fire safety. So bits of that might be appropriate depending on the nature of your assessment and what you find. And if there are areas that are of a concern, it may prompt a more detailed review. I mentioned the cross newsletters. So these are effectively a prerequisite for anyone who's doing anything to do with the Building Safety Act, which is effectively all of us. So these obviously are very good at highlighting common issues and common concerns. Not everything will obviously be directly relevant to a structural risk assessment that you might be doing, but there's definitely things in here around balconies and transfer slabs and various common issues that are definitely well worth being aware of. And that's true of the safety alerts as well, which obviously highlight specific concerns. So definitely recommend that you're staying on top of these and signed up. Following the initial desktop review, it's then generally sensible to do a site inspection of the building before you actually get into any risk assessment. Obviously, you can learn a lot from a building from the drawings and from any kind of record information available, but until you've seen it in person, you don't have the full picture. Typically, at least initially, the site inspection will be non-intrusive, it will be visual, it will typically be limited to readily accessible areas. So you'll have common areas such as receptions, corridors, stairwells, plant rooms, car park areas, maybe retail properties if they're kind of used at ground level. In some cases, you'll have accessible rooftops. In many kind of apartment blocks, you'll also have podium areas with landscaping. You'll generally have access around the building perimeter, which will allow you to do things like look at balconies, for example, and get a feel for their form. Are there any obvious signs of corrosion, etc.? Typically, the residential units will obviously be off limits because they're occupied by people, and that tends to make up quite a large proportion of the building. So that is often a challenge. And even where you do have access to the building, often it's going to be hidden behind finishes. So it's a naturally kind of limited exercise, but you can glean quite a lot from a kind of thorough investigation of the areas that you can get to. The observations from this are then fed back into the risk assessment process. So you've got your desktop study and you've got your sort of site inspection and your observations, and the two of those together then go directly into the risk assessment process. It may be that you need to do further assessment as a result of that process and things that come out of it, but at least initially, generally a visual inspection is a kind of appropriate level of information to feed into the review.